Kenya is a country in transition, and so is most of the countries in our region. We're in transition with respect to the economic field. We're in transition with respect to the political arena. We're in transition with respect to the social environment, the generational gap. We're in transition in those respects, and that's a major challenge.
Turn the clock backwards to 45 years ago. It's possible if these countries have grown at the same pace as Kenya, that the population has increased by a factor of 4 or 5 times. But the land resource is still the same. The water resource is still largely the same. The production techniques are marginally improved, but you have to support 5 times more people, of whom 80% depend on agriculture as their basic livelihood and as their basic source of food. So in my lifetime, our population will have increased by a factor of 10. And this must be fed, it must be watered, they must have some income, and that is part of the challenge that is really affecting agricultural production, agricultural productivity, and food security in this region. In the rain-fed areas, and if I come back to Kenya, because of that population increase, the amount of productive land available to a household is declining very, very sharply. In the space of 50 years, you've come down from a market surplus to subsistence or below subsistence. I think we need to keep that in mind as the framework that is happening. And in some parts of the country, you have very hungry, poor, settled farmers, very hungry, urban, poor, and very hungry, armed pastoralists. That's the picture.
Kind of takes away the question.
Okay, and that means that if you're planning to do any form of relief, you have to take into consideration that the urban people, the urban poor must be taken care of, whether it's price support of subsidized food, and then you've got to provide relief to the people who are facing hunger in the settled areas. And then somebody has got to be strong enough to go to the areas where people are armed and also provide them with relief. Last month, the President and the Prime Minister simultaneously launched a 4-point strategy, the first of which is to provide relief food for the worst hit people and to keep the schools open in the poorer, dry areas, because the school feeding program sometimes happens to be the only way to feed families in some of the poorest areas. Second was to do water distribution and boreholes in as many places as possible. The third was to mobilize the army and the police and other forces to provide logistical support to make sure that the food gets to the places where it was needed. And then realizing that out of a population of 40 million, 30 million can still buy their food, we created a market operation by making all the food imports duty and tax-free, so that then the private importers can bring in the food. And in the last few months, they've already brought in about 8 million bags, and they continue to bring in the food. And so those who have purchasing power are able to buy. The immediate direction towards increasing food production has been to bring in 40,000 acres of land into irrigation. The idea being that we can't really depend on rain-fed agriculture anymore, because we now know from some of the studies that the 80% of Kenya that is dry is going to get drier because of climate change, and the 20% is going to get maybe a little wetter, but it's already overcrowded and it's split into these smaller and smaller farm plots that I was talking about. And so the only way forward is to to go and make irrigation schemes in the river basins where there's more land, and the next 5 years we hope that will add that will contribute at least 20% of the food that we need. And the other thing is also to try and provide some subsidized fertilizer and seeds for the 2 planting seasons.
The only, I think, encouragement that we got from the international community, and I'd like to probably talk a little bit about that, is the last G20 meeting. No, actually, it wasn't the last one. It was the one that took place in London, where the G20 countries committed themselves to providing massive support for food security and food production, which was actually a departure from what happened in the past, where you found that in a place like Ethiopia, for instance, the international community would provide 40 million for relief and only 4 million for increasing food production. So basically, I mean, putting the emphasis on basically the wrong end of the spectrum, because if you increased food production in Ethiopia, for instance, you would not have had to deal with the provision of relief, support, because they would have been able to produce enough food for themselves.
The U.S. government and the international donor community have evidently come to realize that the achievement of food security will come about through sustainable agricultural development and people's ability to produce food. That sounds like such an obvious linkage, but it's been a 20-year battle by a lot of the people in this room to get the U.S. government and the international donors to that point. So to that I just say hallelujah, because it means that their support should, and we're waiting to see, and you're probably closer to the pulse on Capitol Hill, if that realizes itself in support for agricultural programs.